Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, recently we completed our look at the life of Frederick the Great from Extra History, and I find myself interested in learning a little bit more German history today. So we're going to be taking a look at the life of Frederick's brother's great-great-great-grandson, a man we know as Kaiser Wilhelm II, who has a fascinating story of his own and whose story is so incredibly linked to the history of the 20th century and to our modern world as we know it because of his involvement in things like the Great War. Kaiser Wilhelm also is a German who has a lot of English roots, which also happen to be German, but hey, who's counting? Because if the rules that are in place today for the succession to the British crown were in place back then, Kaiser Wilhelm would have become the king in the United Kingdom because he was the eldest child of the eldest child of Queen Victoria. He was her first grandchild. So a lot of deep ties there between the royal families as well. So we're going to be taking a look at Kaiser Wilhelm II on the Biographics channel with our good friend Simon Whistler. I'll put the link in the description below as always so you can check that out. I'll also put links to some of the other videos that I've done from that channel in the past. Let's go ahead and dive in.
He was the child from hell, born into royalty with a deformity that put a lifelong chip on his shoulder. But by the time he became ruler of Germany, this grandson of Queen Victoria had grown to hate the British, hate the French, and, well, hate just about every other European power. Over the next 20 years, he orchestrated the tension that exploded into the nightmare that was World War I. And in this week's Biographics, we uncover the mixed-up life of Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Now, just off the bat, typically I very much agree with kind of the thesis statement that is given at the beginning of these videos, and I agree with some of that. I know it's a little sensationalist to say it, but I don't know that I lay all the blame for the tension that unfolds in Europe at the feet of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Is he definitely partially responsible for it? Absolutely. They ramp up the tension through things like the naval kind of arms race and things like that, and he gives the carte blanche to Austria-Hungary that allows them to escalate things into what becomes the Great War, but I'm not entirely sure I'm ready to lay it all at his feet. Well, he looks like Queen Victoria in that picture. You can see her in
The
his
child
face.
who was to become Kaiser Wilhelm II was born Friedrich Wilhelm Victor Albert von Hohenzollern. The date was January the 27th, 1859, and the place was Potsdam in what was then the state of Prussia.
So yeah, Hohenzollern is their family name, much like Habsburg or Windsor, or in this case now the British royal family technically is Mountbatten Windsor.
His father was Prince Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, while his mother was the English Princess Victoria. The birth was not an easy one, with the doctor having great difficulty getting the baby out of the birth canal. As a result, Wilhelm's left arm was virtually useless, being significantly shorter than his other arm. Many historians believe that Wilhelm's deformity stunted his emotional growth and contributed to his reckless behavior in later life.
Absolutely could be true. I think from everything I've learned about the man, there's definitely, as he said at the beginning, a chip on his shoulder over that. And you can learn that from different things about his life growing up. But he's really easy to identify in videos and in photographs because of that deformity, because you always see that left arm just kind of pinned at his side, usually holding something. And you only ever see the right arm moving. So in a lot of old films and things like that from the Great War, it's usually easy, because a lot of people sometimes look alike with similar facial hair and similar features, but you can always tell who he is because of that arm.
What is certain is that he was extremely self-conscious about his impaired arm and constantly sought ways to hide the deformity. Wilhelm was second in line to be the King of Prussia. He was also the first grandson born to England's Queen Victoria. Victoria was fond of the child, considering to be a well-mannered youngster. From the start, however, he demonstrated a volatile disposition. At the age of 4, he was taken to England to attend a royal wedding. Part of his tiny uniform included a small dagger. During the ceremony, Wilhelm began fidgeting. His uncle, standing alongside, nudged him and told him to be still, but the fiery 4-year-old, he was having none of it. He pulled out the dagger and threatened to stab his uncle. Then, when the uncle attempted to restrain him, Wilhelm bit him in the leg. Grandmother
Holy cow, I did not know any of that. That is fascinating. And that tells me that, I mean, even before he's old enough to really appreciate the things going on around him, there seems to be a disposition there that probably needed to be dealt with. And I don't think that typically royal families were well equipped to deal with emotional issues like that.
Victoria would not have been amused, but fortunately she never found out about the incident. Wilhelm's mother was constantly worrying about her son. In addition to having to contend with his angry manner, she felt guilty about his arm deformity, irrationally blaming herself for the condition. She worried that it would prevent him from fulfilling his obligations as heir to the throne. One thing she was determined not to let the arm deformity do was stop her son from riding a horse. As a result, she ensured that he began taking horse riding lessons at the age of 8. The lessons were hell for the future ruler. He constantly fell from the horse, largely due to the lack of balance caused by his deformed arm. Yet, after weeks of persevering, often with tears rolling down his cheeks, he managed to overcome his limitations, becoming a capable horseman. In 1871, the German Empire officially came into being. It was to be ruled by the King of Prussia. 12-year-old Wilhelm was now second in line to become the head of 2 nations. In his preteen years, Wilhelm had been privately tutored. From the age of 13, however, he was sent to the Friedrichsgymnasium in Kassel. He proved to be a talented student, performing well in all of his studies.
So I'm trying to figure out when he says that he was going to be the head of 2 nations. I mean, I guess technically what he's saying is that he'd be both King of Prussia and Emperor of Germany. And I've had some people comment lately. I actually responded to one a while back about talking about the difference between a country and a nation. And yes, there is a difference. A nation is more about a people group that doesn't necessarily have a country. A country is a political entity. So yeah, it's important to note that right up until, I think, the 1930s, political entities like Prussia still existed. Prussia was a country, and Saxony and all these different... In fact, let's take a look at a map to see what we're talking about. So here you go. Here are the constituent states of the German Empire. It had 4 kingdoms, so it wasn't just Prussia that had a king. Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg also have kings. You have grand duchies like Baden and Hesse and others. There are duchies, there are principalities, and then there are free cities, and then the imperial territory of Alsace and Lorraine, which is that area that borders with France that kind of goes back and forth over time. It's the extreme southwest part of Germany. So the King of Prussia becomes emperor of the German Empire, but that does not mean there aren't other kings that are existing within that empire.
He graduated at the age of 18 in 1877. Grandmother Victoria was so delighted with her special boy that she awarded him the Order of the Garter, one of the highest that she could have bestowed upon him.
Yeah, the Order of the Garter is a really big deal in the UK. So much so that the chapel that is dedicated to the Order of the Garter is where Queen Elizabeth II is now buried, as are her parents, grandparents, lots of other family members. It was established by Edward III. It's the highest order of chivalry that can be bestowed by the monarch, and there can only be 25 members at any given time. So there are always a couple of vacancies that can be filled. And it's sometimes given to members of royal families from other places. And so this is a really big deal that Kaiser Wilhelm is a part of this.
After graduating, he attended the University of Bonn. For the next 4 years, he studied law and politics. In addition to his formal studies, Wilhelm was inculcated into the military ideals of Prussian manliness. This concept of the tough, disciplined military man was closely aligned with that of Prussian nationalism. Although his mother tried hard to impress the Victorian ideals of liberalism upon him, Wilhelm shunned them in favor of the Prussian way. Wilhelm's military service began at the age of 21. He was given the rank of first lieutenant in the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, based in Potsdam. He took to army life like a duck to water. He later said the following about his time in the military: "I really found my family, my friends, and my interests, everything of which I, up to that time, had to do without." Above all, his time in the military imbued the young prince with self-confidence. He became surer in his bearing, and he began to speak with an air of authority.
So this was important for him, right? Because he grows up very self-conscious about this deformity that he has in his arm. And so now he's got to find his voice. He's got to find who he is. And granted, he was born into that, right? So it's not exactly a meritocracy where he's given these ranks because he's got the ability and the knowledge, but rather because of who his father is. But that doesn't mean that he's not going to be able to gain something from serving as a lieutenant.
However, the more he developed as a military man, the more distant he became from his parents. He viewed them as being too invested in British liberalism at the expense of Prussian nationalism. Wilhelm was 21 when he met his future wife, Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein. She was also known as Donna. It wasn't his first foray of the heart. A couple of years before, he had fallen hard for his first cousin, Princess Elizabeth of Hesse-Darmstadt, but she had refused his marriage proposal. Not so with Donna, and the couple got engaged in 1880. They were married in 1881, and they'd go on to have 7 children. Following his marriage, Wilhelm gained a powerful ally in the form of Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck, who saw the prince as a means of advancing his own political career.
Unfortunately, that alliance is only going to last so long, and I think that was probably a negative for the Germans, that there's kind of a falling out between these guys.
He would use the boy as a means of gaining an advantage over their parents. With Bismarck pulling strings, Wilhelm began to be sent on diplomatic missions. The first was to St. Petersburg to attend a coming-of-age ceremony for 16-year-old Tsarevich Nicholas. But the haughty and arrogant Wilhelm did not make a favorable impression on Tsar Alexander. 2 years later, in 1886, Wilhelm went with his grandfather to visit the Austrian-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph.
So these are both really important parts of the story, right? Franz Joseph is going to be his ally in the First World War. Nicholas is going to be his enemy. But they actually had, from all accounts, it seems like Wilhelm and Nicholas had a pretty positive relationship. And that leads to this series of telegrams that are known as the Willie and Nicky telegrams, because that's how they signed their messages to each other.
This trip went better, largely because Wilhelm was under the ever-watchful eye of his grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I.
And you might think, well, wait a second, how do we go from his grandfather being Kaiser right to him being Kaiser? Well, I'm sure they're going to explain that in just a minute, because his father's not on the throne very long.
Meanwhile, Bismarck worked at preparing Wilhelm for rulership. He encouraged him to view all things English with disdain and to reject the worldview of his parents. Then, on March 9, 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died. Wilhelm's father now inherited the role, but just a few months into his reign, he succumbed to throat cancer. Wilhelm now became Kaiser Wilhelm II of Prussia and Germany. He was 29 years of age, and the date was June 15, 1888.
Completely technically speaking, he became Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. He became the king of Prussia. Semantics, I know. But so let's talk context. What's happening in 1888? Well, this is the year of the Jack the Ripper murders in London. This is also, we're into the last decade and a half or so of Queen Victoria's reign. So he comes to the throne of Germany while his grandmother is still the queen for the United Kingdom. And of course, he's cousins with Nicholas II. Nicholas II's wife is actually Wilhelm's first cousin. She's also a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Nicholas is a little more distantly related. They're related a couple of different ways, Wilhelm and Nicholas.
Immediately upon ascending the throne, Wilhelm came into conflict with his advisors. Chief among them was Otto von Bismarck. The experienced statesman advocated a policy of peaceful relations with the other heads of state in Europe. But Wilhelm was intent on extending the territorial borders of Germany and was ready to pursue an aggressive international stance. Bismarck had been the trusted foreign advisor to Kaiser Wilhelm I, but the new Kaiser had no such trust for the statesman. For his part, Bismarck thought, once Wilhelm ascended to the throne, that he would be able to manipulate and control him. He soon realized that he'd been very wrong. Wilhelm's tolerance for Bismarck reached its limit when the old man tried to implement an anti-socialist policy. Wilhelm opposed the policy at every opportunity. Eventually, the two had a heated encounter, which ended with Wilhelm demanding Bismarck's resignation.
Not necessarily the best thing, and let's just acknowledge this here, right? Bismarck was a warrior first and foremost, right? I mean, that's what he's known for, blood and iron, you know. But at the same time, he was also a much shrewder diplomat than Kaiser Wilhelm is. Wilhelm does not really play well with others, as we're finding out, and as we'll continue to find out.
With Bismarck as foreign minister, a balanced state of peace existed between Germany, France, and Russia. The Russians, they now had no confidence in Wilhelm's ability to maintain the peace, and so they grew closer with France. The peace between Russia and Germany began to grow increasingly fragile. In the early 1900s, Wilhelm focused on building up Germany's navy. He saw a powerful navy as being a symbol of Germany's position as a world superpower, and he became obsessed with the idea of huge ships.
And this is not unique to Germany at this time, right? We're talking, as I was talking about the U.S. presidents and ranking them, we're talking about this exact same time period, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, where the American Navy is being built up, and you have a series of presidents who recognize the need for a Navy. Why? Because your Navy is your main avenue through which you project power throughout the world. Your army, the Prussians have a powerful army, but your army helps you on the continent of Europe. It doesn't help you build and maintain colonies in the Pacific and in Africa and other places. And who's the preeminent naval power in the world? The British. And who has the largest empire in the world? The British, because they have the Navy that can sustain that. So the Americans are building up their Navy. The Germans are now going to build up their Navy. The Russians are going to find out their Navy sucks and lose a war trying to project that power in the Pacific. They're going to lose the Russo-Japanese War, in large part because of the failure of their Navy. So this is, in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, this is the equivalent of what you have with the Cold War in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, where you have a nuclear arms race, only this is going to be a naval arms race. And what happens with the nuclear arms race? You have treaties that are put in place to try and scale back the ever-growing threat of nuclear war. And so you're going to have the same thing happen really after the First World War is when it happens in a big way, where you have these naval treaties. They're going to attempt to kind of scale back the size of navies.
Many hours were spent drawing his own designs of ships. He also made sure to let the rest of Europe know how he was building up his nation's military might. At the same time that he was stretching his international muscles, Wilhelm was making domestic improvements. He reformed public education to make it available to every child. He was also an advocate of the arts and sciences, starting the Kaiser Wilhelm Society to advance scientific research. Wilhelm had by now managed to alienate most of the leaders of Europe. He was lacking in patience, he had an explosive temper, and possessed no tact whatsoever. An infamous example of his ability to alienate others was when, in 1896, he sent a telegram to President Kruger of the Transvaal Republic in South Africa. The message congratulated Kruger for his suppression of the British-led Jamestown raid. When news of the telegram reached Britain, it caused an outcry of rage against Germany. Even before this incident, even those in the British royal family who were related to Wilhelm, they didn't like him. In addition to his natural arrogance, his over-racism alienated others. He constantly warned European leaders of the Yellow Peril, referring to Japan and China. While he was content to alienate the European powers, Wilhelm went out of his way to develop cordial relations with the leaders of the Ottoman Empire. His first trip to Istanbul was in 1889. He made a deal to sell guns to the Ottoman army. 9 years later, he undertook a month-long trip through the Holy Land.
So why the Ottomans? I mean, obviously, if you have a natural rivalry with the Russians have kind of set themselves up, especially over the last 100 years, as the main threat to the Ottomans, the main rival to the Ottomans. And of course, you had a war that took place in Crimea that involves Russia and the Ottomans and the British. And so if you can't be friends with Russia, the best thing you can do is be friends with their natural enemy. And so this is where we're going to see the Central Powers starting to form, right? You're going to have Germany and the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians and even the Italians for a while, all of these Central European powers.
Before heading home, he professed his undying friendship for the Turks. In 1905, Wilhelm committed one of his biggest diplomatic blunders when he visited Tangier in Morocco. There, he met with representatives of Sultan Abdulaziz, expressing his support for Moroccan sovereignty. This was a direct challenge to the French, who had a large military presence in Morocco. It also further alienated the Kaiser from the international community. What became known as the Moroccan crisis also served to bring previous lifelong rivals France and Britain closer together in their opposition to the aggressive stance of the German ruler. In 1908, Wilhelm agreed to an interview for the British newspaper The Daily Telegraph, seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen Anglo-German relations. During the interview, his fiery...
So let's pause there for a second, because we need to recognize he's attempting to make relations better with the British, with the royal family that he's related to. I mean, King George V is, well, at this point it's still Edward, his uncle, is the king. And after 1910, it's going to be his cousin, King George V. So he can't both hate the British, but also be trying, well, I guess he can. He could hate them, but also still recognize the importance to get along with them. But I don't think it's fair to say that Wilhelm was trying to ramp things up to a conflict between the two. I think he wanted to be strong. He wanted to be a rival of the British, but he also didn't want to be at war with the British.
Temper got the better of him, and he managed to insult the British people numerous times, as well as insinuating that the Russians and French had tried to pull Germany into the Second Boer War. The whole interview was a disaster, and it greatly embarrassed the German people. Calls were even made for Wilhelm to abdicate. In the wake of the fallout from the interview, Wilhelm laid low. After a month, he emerged, and he immediately forced his chancellor, Prince Bülow, to resign, blaming him for authorizing the disastrous interview in the first place. This was a terrible move, and it lost him a lot of the internal support that he had remaining. This episode stole away any of the self-confidence that Wilhelm still had. He fell into a deep state of depression. All of his energy was thrown into his pet project of building up the German Navy. His obsession with building more powerful battleships than the British got his country into serious financial hardship. By the beginning of 1914, Wilhelm had managed to alienate all of the major powers in Europe, undoing all of the work that Bismarck had done when Wilhelm I was Kaiser.
I don't think it's fair to say he alienated all of the major powers of Europe. Many, perhaps, but not all.
One of the few friends that he had was Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria. The assassination of Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, deeply affected Wilhelm. When it was revealed that an underground movement called the Black Hand was behind the murder, he extended his full support in hunting them down. He also urged Austria-Hungary to use force against Serbia, implying that he would back them up. Egged on by Wilhelm, Franz Joseph I of Austria made demands of Serbia that were impossible to meet. When the deadline to meet the conditions passed without satisfaction, Austria declared war on Serbia. In response to this, Russian troops began to mobilize.
Now let's pause for a second, because there's a major part of this that's missing, which is that Wilhelm very inconveniently goes on vacation during this diplomatic crisis that happens in the summer of 1914. And we've talked about this in other videos, so we're not going to go into detail, but when Wilhelm returns from vacation and discovers that the Serbians have agreed to 9 of the 10 demands being made by the Austro-Hungarians, he basically said, well, this removes any argument for war that there could be. So while he gave permission for the Austrian, basically gave permission by saying, listen, we'll back you, because they knew that the threat with Russia was very real, he also did what he could to try and avoid that. The problem was he waited until it was too late to do that. But he didn't push for war right at the end. He was trying to pull them back, but at this point he had set the ball rolling in such a way that his military was ramping things up, and the Russians were ramping things up, and the Austro-Hungarians were ramping things up. And so in some ways, by his inaction during those crucial weeks, he allowed it to get to the point of no return.
In order to defend Serbia from attack. Wilhelm learned of the Russian mobilization on July the 30th. He knew that his treaty obligations with Austria meant that he was bound to declare war on Russia. He was also convinced that England and Russia and France had conspired to knock out Germany. This meant that he would be faced with attack from 2 fronts, the Russians from the east and the British and French from the west.
Not entirely, because let's remember, the British are not necessarily guaranteed to get into this war. It's only when Germany invades through Belgium that pulls the British in. Would the British have come in eventually? Quite possibly, but it probably would have been too late.
Back in 1905, a prominent German general by the name of von Schlieffen had devised a plan of attack on France. Now the general's nephew, Helmuth von Moltke, adapted the plan to fight a 2-front war.
Had to pause for a second and do a little research, because when he referred to von Moltke the Younger being Schlieffen's nephew, is that true? Can somebody tell me if that's true? I feel like maybe they're kind of mixing up von Moltke and his uncle, the elder von Moltke. I wasn't aware of any relationship between von Schlieffen and von Moltke, so I don't think they're related, and I didn't find any evidence of that, but maybe I'm missing something. I don't know.
Plan called for a preemptive strike on the weaker country. That weaker country, it was France. Once that attack had been successfully carried out, the focus could then switch to Russia. Wilhelm, he was sold on the plan, but his generals, not so much. They were convinced that Russia was not prepared for war and wanted to strike to the east first. The reality was that the Russians were indeed ready and had their army mobilized to defend the Serbians. Wilhelm got his way, though, and the Schlieffen Plan was put into action. However, it proved to be a disaster. As the German war effort lurched on, Wilhelm's influence became less and less as Germany's top military officials, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, took the reins.
So we're skipping a lot here. Obviously, we're doing a biography of Kaiser Wilhelm, so we're not going into details about World War I. There's other places we can do that, but there's a lot that happens between the beginning of the war and Ludendorff and Hindenburg coming to power, which is much later in the war, because they start out in the east. Eventually they're brought west to take over halfway through the war. They take over after you have von Moltke at the beginning, and then you have Erich Ludendorff, or not Erich Ludendorff, you have von Falkenhayn, and then you have Ludendorff and Hindenburg, who basically end up running a de facto military dictatorship by the end of the war.
The Kaiser busied himself with awarding medals and officiating at military ceremonies. His moods followed a manic-depressive pattern, fluctuating between euphoria that Germany was about to crush the Allies and despair that all was lost. As the war drew to a conclusion in the closing months of 1918, US President Woodrow Wilson announced that the German Kaiser would not be permitted to take part in any peace negotiations. This effectively made Wilhelm a lame duck leader.
Now let's recognize that Wilson didn't have the power to just declare that, right? He declared that, but other people also felt that way, which is why there are a lot of other reasons why Kaiser Wilhelm ends up having to abdicate that have nothing to do with what the Allied powers think about the whole thing. But we're going to see four empires that are going to fall apart throughout this, right? The Russians, the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Germans are all going to lose their empires.
As German capitulation drew ever nearer, a revolt broke out in Germany. The vast majority of people, they were just sick and tired of this bungling, arrogant leader. There were calls for his abdication. Still, Wilhelm vacillated. Even without any support at all, he thought that he could retain at least one or even two of his crowns. But the constitution had stipulated that the two crowns were to be forever intertwined. Abdication from one throne meant abdication from both of them. On November the 9th, Chancellor Prince Max von Baden announced that Wilhelm was abdicating. He did this in order to stem the tide of revolution. But the Chancellor's efforts, they backfired, and he himself was forced to resign. However, the next day, November the 10th, Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands. At this time, he had still not abdicated. Over the next weeks, however, his top military advisor, Paul von Hindenburg, advised abdication. The general made it clear that Wilhelm did not enjoy the support of the army, and they would not back him when they returned from the war.
And if you don't have the army, especially in a place like Prussia, you don't have anything.
Realizing that the situation was untenable, Wilhelm faced reality and abdicated on November the 28th, 1918. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war, was signed on June the 28th, 1919. It branded Kaiser Wilhelm as a war criminal and stipulated that he be prosecuted for a supreme offense against international morality and the sanctity of treaties. The Netherlands government, however, they refused to extradite Wilhelm. The situation was actually...
Remember, the Netherlands is neutral during the First World War. They're not involved like they are in the Second World War.
Pleasing to President Wilson, who felt that the trial and prosecution of the Kaiser would only prolong tensions between Germany and the rest of Europe. The best thing would just be for Wilhelm to remain in the Netherlands.
Which he did.
Wilhelm purchased a house in the municipality of Dorn. He would remain there for the rest of his life. The new German Weimar Republic allowed him to transport some of his possessions there from his old palace near Potsdam. He now made it his life's mission to clear his name of wrongdoing when it came to the war. In April 1921, Wilhelm's wife, Donna, she died. A few months earlier, their son had committed suicide. These deaths were a devastating blow to the exiled Kaiser. In 1922, William wrote a memoir in which he defended his international policy and put forth his case that he was not responsible for a war that had led to 10 million deaths.
10 million military deaths is probably closer to, I think some estimates have it a little closer to 17, 18 million total between military and civilian. Yeah, this is a pretty common thing that happens after the war, is that you have a lot of people, including a lot of the generals like Ludendorff and Falkenhayn and others, writing their own stories. It became after the war very much about telling your side and getting people to your defense and explaining yourself. Because of, if you're letting other people speak for you and you're not speaking yourself, people are just going to go with whatever other people say. So it became an opportunity to kind of defend himself and say, this is why I did what I did, and this is why I'm not to be blamed the way that other people think I am.
At the same time, he became socially active in the Netherlands, entertaining high-profile guests and engaging his passions for archaeology and hunting. He also started a new hobby: wood chopping. Despite his withered arm, he became quite proficient at it, chopping down thousands of trees during the last 2 decades of his life. In mid-1920s...
There's actually, I want to see if I can find it. There's a video somewhere showing him chopping wood. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, so the title says chopping wood, but I think he's actually just throwing wood in this one. This is from 1937, so very near to the end of his life, but there you have the Kaiser. And you'll see him, and again, notice only the right arm is moving. You don't see the left arm moving at all. It's tucked behind him. And he's just kind of hurling little pieces of wood for the camera, I guess. So we don't really see him chopping wood in that situation.
22, Wilhelm met Princess Hermine Roos of Greece. There was an immediate mutual attraction, and they were married on November the 9th. During the 1930s, Wilhelm paid close attention to the rise of Nazism. He never embraced the party or its leader, but did hold out hope that Hitler would eventually restore the monarchy. It was his vain hope that his oldest grandson would be appointed as Kaiser once that occurred. His wife Hermine even sent a request to that effect to Adolf Hitler. But the Führer, he wasn't interested. In fact, he held a special hatred for Wilhelm, blaming him for the disastrous defeat in the First World War.
Part of that whole stab in the back myth, right? The military on the ground were going to win the war, but the political leadership stabbed us in the back. They betrayed us, blaming people for this. And Wilhelm, by the way, during all of this time, refused to return to Germany unless his crown was restored to him.
As Hitler's actions became more extreme, the former leader of Germany, observing from his exiled home in the Netherlands, became increasingly alarmed at what was taking place under Nazi rule. When he had heard that Hitler ordered the murder of the wife of a chancellor, he commented, "We have ceased to live under the rule of law, and everyone must be prepared for the possibility that the Nazis will push their way in and put them up against a wall." Wilhelm's antipathy towards Hitler became personal. He believed that the Führer was turning his cherished military into a gang of thugs. However, as Hitler began to rack up international military victories, Wilhelm changed his tune and began to heap praise upon him. When the Netherlands were occupied in May of 1940, he received the following message from Wilhelm. "My Führer, I congratulate you and hope that under your marvelous leadership, the German monarchy will be restored completely." Hitler wasn't...
So listen, it's not support for Hitler, it's an agenda. It's, let me cozy up to this guy so I can get my throne back.
Amused. In fact, he referred to Wilhelm as an idiot. That impression was reinforced when, following the fall of Paris, he received this message. "Congratulations, you have won using my troops." Under the German occupation, Wilhelm's house was kept under German guard. This was more there to provide protection for the old Kaiser, who was now 82, than to imprison him. It was done at the behest of a Nazi general, and when Hitler found out about it, he was furious and had the general fired. Kaiser Wilhelm II died on June 4, 1941, of a pulmonary embolism. In the death, Adolf Hitler saw an opportunity to make political capital.
Yep.
He ordered that the body be returned to Berlin for a state funeral. He saw this as a way of showing to the German people that the Third Reich was just a continuation of the old German Empire. But Hitler's wishes, they were denied. Wilhelm had made it clear to the Dutch authorities that he would never return to Germany until the monarchy was restored. The Dutch government acceded to these wishes, and the body remained in the Netherlands, where he was given a military funeral. He was buried in a mausoleum on the property of Dorn that was his Dutch home. There he remains to this very day. So I really hope you found...
Yeah, and I was hoping to visit Kaiser Wilhelm's home there when I was in the Netherlands, but the day I had available to visit, it was closed. So I'm hoping someday I'll get the chance to go back there, maybe do a video about the Kaiser from that site. So hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you learned a little something. Obviously, to cover a long life like that, you're skipping over a lot of the details, and so I hope to provide a little bit of that, but we couldn't get into all of it. But I'll throw some links up here at the end on the end screen for some other things you can check out. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.